So my research focused on the memory formation processes related to the 1999 NATO bombing of Serbia. I analyzed how these memories affected the present-day opinions and attitudes of the people born in the 1990s, that is, young adults today in Serbia. Essentially, my research question was if there was any difference between the types of remembering that occurred within this generation. So one of my main hypotheses was that the bombing became a formative event in the socialization processes of this generational cohort. And based on the different ways that their memories of the event shaped their opinions, I was able to create a typology in which I divided members of the generation into 5 specific remembering groups, as I called them, which I will discuss a bit further later on. So first, I would like to give you a little bit of a background. So the 1999 NATO bombing of Serbia, then the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, was the first time that NATO authorized airstrikes on a territory of a sovereign country without the full approval of the UN Security Council and indirect breach of the UN Charter. So the bombing was part of a bigger effort to halt the conflict between Serbs and Albanians on the territory of Kosovo, which at the time was still an autonomous province within Serbia. So for my research, I choose to focus on the people born between the year 1990 and 1997. The reason why I chose this particular cutoff is twofold. So firstly, this group of people that was born in this 7-year span regarded the bombing as one of the defining events of the 1990s, since it impacted their lives directly and they didn't really have any prior knowledge of the events that occurred before this specific event. And secondly, this was their last generation with any direct personal memory of this specific event and also of the 1990s as a whole, since the generations that came after them already were kind of swept with the wave of the 2000 democratic reforms that took place in Serbia, and as well as the start of the transition period for Serbia. So then it could be argued that for this specific group, the bombing is directly linked to the ideas and staples of the Serbian national identity, especially because it comes to, especially when it comes to the role of Kosovo in Serbian public discourses, even today, since this is still a contested topic. So when discussing this topic, obviously, I relied heavily on Ron Eierman's theory of cultural trauma, in which he defines cultural trauma as an event that impacts a whole group. So this kind of trauma has to be processed and communicated through public discourse in order to be explained and reflected upon. Since this is a trauma that affects, as Eierman writes, a group of people who have achieved some degree of social cohesion. This generational group, so this cohort of 7 years, would be either affected as classmates or just friends, but peers mostly and firstly. So unfortunately, this type of discourse can easily be manipulated by government or religious officials or any other interest groups with power that have any potential reason to influence this kind of event, or the way that this event is being regarded in the public. So this makes it all the more important to facilitate an open and honest conversation about the said trauma and the events that triggered this trauma. Otherwise, this can lead to what Eierman refers to as a dramatic loss of collective meaning, and it can pose a challenge for identity narratives to different generations. So therefore, it should be regarded in a generational context. And as I already mentioned, so generations coming after this specific generation would only regard the bombing as part of the broader 1990s conflict, rather than reflect on this specific event and its importance for them and their formative process. The same as older generations would also regard the bombing as only a significant part of the whole decade, or they would most likely pick out some other part that was of bigger influence for them. So for the methodology part, I conducted an online survey with 175 members of this generational cohort, in which I asked them to answer essay-style open questions with up to a paragraph's length related to their memories of the bombing, their opinions of the bombing, as well as their current opinions and attitudes related to topics such as the Serbia-Kosovo relationship, their opinions and attitudes about NATO, about the EU, and also about the significance of Kosovo for Serbian national identity today. And from these answers, I was able to derive my typology, which I already mentioned in the beginning, and this gave me 5 remembering groups. So the first group was the angry group. So this group was defined by angry and opinionated answers. They were prejudiced answers against all the other actors in the conflict, except for Serbia. The answers were not related to their personal experience. They were actually much more related to recycled propaganda or misinformation or official information that was distributed at the time. Also, their current views were very negative towards Serbia's potential membership into the EU, as well as any kind of cooperation with NATO. And they were very clear and quick to denounce Kosovo's declaration of independence, and they emphasized the importance of Kosovo for the Serbian national identity, so not only territorially, but also religiously, historically, spiritually, and on any other plane. So the second group was the objective group. This group was had more moderate answers. They were kind of more objective, and they blamed all of the sides for the conflict. They rather discussed key events that happened during the bombing rather than discussing any kind of personal memories or any kind of emotions. And they were mostly disenchanted with the idea of the European Union or any kind of positive Serbia-Kosovo relationship, but there was no direct and specific denunciation of Kosovo's independence as it was in the angry group. So the third group was the indifferent group. So the indifferent group had a very detached approach. They had very factual renditions of the bombing itself. So they were mostly citing peace talks, they were citing treaties, they were citing resolutions that happened before, during, and after the bombing. Their answers on their specific memories were mostly factographic. They were very short and unemotional. And their opinions towards the EU, NATO, and the Serbian-Kosovo relationship were very neutral. So the fourth group was the emotional group, and this was the group that was that mostly reflected on their personal memories and their emotions, and it was a very personal approach to the bombing itself. So it wasn't necessarily regarded as a political situation or a political event or any kind of conspiracy. So it was mostly they were mostly eager to discuss it as a traumatic event or some kind of tear in the social fabric, as Eierman said. So they were very detailed about their memories of the bombing, so what they were doing, who they were with, where they were with. They recalled specific events. They recalled specific emotions that they felt. There was a lot of mention of fear. There was a lot of mention of just feeling injustice, sadness, overall some kind of negative emotions. And when asked about their attitudes about the EU, it was slightly more optimistic than the previous groups. But when asked about Kosovo, they mostly expressed sadness for the living conditions of people living in the territory of Kosovo today. And there was a lot of disagreement with the politicization of the whole situation regarding the Serbia-Kosovo relationship. And finally, we had the non-respondent group, which was mostly reserved, and there was a lot of jokes and sometimes sarcastic comments, but I still chose to include this as a specific group rather than exclude these comments and these answers altogether. So I could say that they were responsive enough to be factored into the typology. And so in conclusion, the generational memory that was displayed in the analysis of this event demonstrates that even though the event was regarded and is regarded as a cultural trauma for all of the members of this generation, each of them had their own way of processing and dealing with its legacy. So this shows us a plurality of the memory constructs surrounding this event, as well as the potential problems, which I will speak about in a second. So the bombing did present, so the hypothesis that I put forth in the beginning turned out to be correct. So the bombing did represent a major event in this generation's socialization processes, and it allowed them to fill in any potential gaps that they might have had and encountered in their memory when recollecting it. So this also opened a window for acceptance of propaganda and misinformation alongside official and unofficial renditions and discourses about the event, the bombing, and the broader conflict in itself. And so this has led to obviously a lot of disagreement and a lot of contestation about the event itself, which can be mostly seen in, for instance, the way that the event is taught in schools. So this can be very biased, it could be very nationalistic leaning. It also has a lot to do with the socialization processes of individuals and what they've been taught, not only in schools, but what they've heard from their parents or their peers, or what most of them cited also a lot of research that they did by themselves, so on the internet, which leads me to another very important point that I wanted to talk about before ending this presentation, is the future effects of social media on this type of on these processes of remembering and memory. So how these generations choose to commemorate the bombing, or what the discourses are that can show up and rise up online regarding the bombing, and also the conflict more broadly, because this conflict is also obviously still being talked about and it's still very disputed in Serbian public discourse. I think that in future research on this topic, it would be very, very, very important and very fruitful to turn to social media to be able to see what the patterns and processes of remembering and commemorating online would be. And this is definitely something that I plan on doing in the future. So that is all that I have prepared for you, and I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to answering any questions that you might have, and I will see you all in September.